Novel The Kite Runner by Khalid Hosseini, chapter number 20. Farid had warned me he had, but as it turned out, he had wasted his breath. We were driving down the red road that winds from Jalalabad to Kabul. The last time I had traveled that road was in a tarpaulin covered truck going to the other way. Baba had nearly gotten himself shot by a singing stoned Rusi officer. Baba had made me so mad that night, so scared, and ultimately so proud. The track between Kabul and Jalalabad, a bone-jarring ride down a teetering pass snaking through the rocks, had become a relic now, a relic of two wars. 20 years earlier, I had seen some of the first war with my own eyes. Grim reminders of it were strewn along the road, burned carcasses of old Soviet tanks, overturned military trucks gone to rust, a crushed Russian jeep that had plunged over the mountainside. The second war I had watched on my TV screen, and now I was seeing it through Farid's eyes. Swerving effortlessly around potholes in the middle of the broken road, Farid was a man in his element. He had become much chattier since our overnight stay at Wahid house. He had me as sit in the passenger seat and looked at me when he spoke. He even smiled once or twice, maneuvering the steering wheel with his mangled hand. He pointed the mud hut villages along the way where he had known people years before. Most of those people, he had said, were either dead or in refugee camps in Pakistan, and sometimes the dead are luckier, he said. He pointed to the crumbled, charred remains of a tiny village. It was just a tuft of blackened, roofless walls now. I saw a dog sleeping along one of the walls. I had a friend there once, Farid said. He was a very good bicycle repairman. He played the tabla well too. The Taliban killed him and his family and burned the village. We drove past the burned village and the dog didn't move. In the old days, the drive from Jalalabad to Kabul took 2 hours, maybe a little more. It took Farid and me our 4 hours to reach Kabul, and when we did, Farid warned me just after we passed the Mahipur Dam. Kabul is not the way you remember it, he said. So I heard. Farid gave me a look that said hearing is not the same as seeing, and he was right, because when Kabul finally did unroll before us, I was certain, absolutely certain, that he had taken a wrong turn somewhere. Farid must have seen my stupefied expression shuttling people back and forth to Kabul. He would have become familiar with that expression on the faces of those who had not seen Kabul for a long time. He patted me on the shoulder. Welcome back, he said morosely. Rubble and beggars everywhere. I looked, that was what I saw. I remember beggars in the old days too. Baba always carried an extra handful of Afghani bills in his pocket just for them. I had never seen him deny a peddler now, though. They squatted at every street corner, dressed in shredded burlap rags, mud-caked hands held out for a coin, and the beggars were mostly children now, thin and grim-faced, some no older than 5 or 6. They sat in the laps of their burqa-clad mothers alongside gutters at busy street corners and chanted, "Bakshish, bakshish," and something else, something I had not noticed right away. Hardly any of them sat with an adult male. The wars had made fathers a rare commodity in Afghanistan. We were driving westbound toward the Courtesy district on what I remembered as a major thoroughfare in the 70s. Jeddah Mein Yawan, just north of us, was the bone-dry Kabul River. On the hills to the south stood the broken old city wall. Just east of it was the Bala Hisar Fort, the ancient citadel that the warlord Dostum had occupied in 1992 on the Shir Darwaza mountain range, the same mountains from which the Mujahideen forces had showered Kabul with rockets between 1992 and 1996, inflicting much of the damage I was witnessing now. The Shir Darwaza range stretched all the way west. It was from those mountains that I remember the firing of the Tope-Chast, the noon cannon. It went off every day to announce noon time, and also the signal the end of daylight fasting during the month of Ramadan. You would hear the roar of that cannon all through the city in those days. I used to come here to Jeddah Mein Wand when I was a kid, I mumbled. There used to be shops here and hotels, neon lights and restaurants. I used to buy kites from an old man named Safu. He ran little kite shop by the old police headquarters. The police headquarters is still there, Farid say. No shortage of police in the city, but you won't find kite or kite shop on Jeddah Mewand or anywhere else in Kabul. Those days are over. Jeddah Mewand had turned into giant sand castle. The buildings that had not entirely collapsed barely stood with caved-in roofs and walls pierced with rocket shells. Entire blocks had been obliterated to rubble. I saw a bullet-poked sign half buried at an angle in a heap of debris. It read "Drink Coca-Cola." I saw children playing in the ruins of a windowless building amid jagged stumps of brick and stone. Bicycle riders and mule-drawn carts swerved around kids, stray dogs, and piles of debris. A haze of dust hovered over the city and across the river. A single plume of smoke rose the sky. Where are the trees? I said. People cut them down for a firewood in the winter, Freeze said. The sure we cut a lot of them down too. Why? Snipers used to hide in them. A sadness came over me. Returning to Kabul was like running into an old forgotten friend and seeing that life had not been good to him, that he had become homeless and destitute. My father built an orphanage in Sharif Khona, the old city south of here, I said. I remembered it, Farid said. It was destroyed a few years ago. Can you pull over? I said. I want to take a quick walk here. Farid parked along the curb on a small back street next to the ramshackle, abandoned building with no door. That used to be pharmacy, Farid muttered. As we exited the truck, we walked back to the Jeddah Mewand and turned right, heading west. What is that smell? I said. Something was making my eyes water. Diesel. Farid replied, the city's generators are always going down, so electricity is unreliable and people use diesel fuel. Diesel? Remember what this street smelled like in the old days? Farid smiled. Kebab. Lamb kebab, I said. Lamb? Farid said, tasting the word in his mouth. The only people in Kabul who get to eat lamb now are the Taliban. He pulled on my sleeve, speaking of which. A vehicle was approaching us. Beard patrol, Farid murmured. That was the first time I saw the Taliban. I had seen them on TV, on the internet, on the cover of magazines and in newspaper, but here I was now less than 50 feet from them, telling myself that the sudden taste in my mouth was not unadulterated naked fear, telling myself my flesh had not suddenly shrunk against my bones and my heart was not battering. Here they came in all their glory. The red Toyota pickup truck idled past us. A handful of stern-faced young men sat on their haunches in the cab, Kalashnikov slung on their shoulders. They all wore beards and black turbans. One of them, a dark-skinned man in his early 20s with thick knitted eyebrow, twirled a whip in his hand and meekly swatted the side of the truck with it. His roaming eyes fell on me. He held my gaze. I would never felt so naked in my entire life. Then the Talib spat tobacco-stained spittle and looked away. I found I could breathe again. The truck rolled down Jeddah Mewand, leaving in the trail a cloud of dust. What is the matter with you? Farid hissed. What? Don't ever stare at them. Do you understand me? Never. I didn't mean to, I said. Your friend is quite right, Aga. You might as well poke a rabid dog with a stick. Someone said this new voice belonged to an old beggar sitting barefoot on the step of a bullet-scarred building. He wore a threadbare chapan worn to frayed shreds and a dirt-crusted turban. His left eyelid drooped over an empty socket. With an arthritic hand, he pointed to the direction the red truck had gone. The drive around looking and hoping that someone will provoke them. Sooner or later, someone always obliges. Then the dog's feast and the day's boredom is broken at last and everyone says Allahu Akbar. And on those days when no one offended, well, there is always random violence, isn't there? Keep your eyes on your feet when the Talib are near, Farid said. Your friend dispenses good advice, the old beggar chimed in. He barked a wet cough and spat in soiled handkerchief. Forgive me, but could you spare a few iguanas? He breathed. Bus, let's go, Farid said, pulling me by the arm. I handed the old man 100,000 Afghanis, or the equivalent of the about $3, when he leaned forward to take the money. His stench, like sour milk and feet that had not been washed in weeks, flooded my nostrils and made my gorge rise. He hurriedly slipped the money in his waist, his lone eye darting side to side. A word of thanks for your benevolence, Agha Sahib. Do you know where the orphanage is in Kartese? I said. It's not hard to find. It is just west of Darul Uman Boulevard, he said. The children were moved from here to Kartese after the rocket hit the old orphanage, which is the saving someone from the lion's cage and throwing them in the tigers. Thank you, Agha, I said. I turned to go. That was your first time, na? I am sorry. The first time you saw a talib? I said nothing. The old beggar nodded and smiled, revealed a handful of remaining teeth, all crooked and yellow. I remembered the first time I saw them rolling in the Kabul. What a joyous day that was, he said. At an end to the killing, wah wah, but like the poet says, how seamless seemed love, and then came trouble. A smile sprouted on my face. I know that ghazal, that's Hafiz. Yes, it is indeed, the old man replied. I should know, I used to teach it at the university. You did? The old man coughed. From 1958 to 1996, I taught Hafiz, Khayyam, Rumi, Bedal, Jami, Sadi. Once I was even guest lecturer in Tehran 1971. That was, I gave a lecture on the mystic Bedal. I remember how they all stood and clapped. Ha! He shook his head. But you saw those young men in the truck. What value do you think they see in Sufism? My mother taught at the university, I said. And what was her name? Sufia Ikrami. His eye managed to twinkle through the veil of cataracts. The desert weed lives on, but the flower of the spring blooms and wilts. Such grace, such dignity, such a tragedy. You knew my mother? I asked, kneeling before the old man. Yes, indeed, the old beggar said. We used to sit and talk after the class. The last time was on a rainy day just before final exams, when we shared a marvelous slice of almond cake together. Almond cake with hot tea and honey. She was rather obviously pregnant by then, and all the more beautiful for it. I will never forget what she said to me that day. What? Please tell me. Baba had always described my mother to me in broad stroke, like she was a great woman, but what I had always thirsted for were the detail, the way her hair glinted in the sunlight, her favorite ice cream flavor, the songs she liked to hum. Did she bite her nails? Baba took his memory of her to the grave with him. Maybe speaking her name would have reminded him of his guilt of what he had done so soon after she had died, or maybe his loss had been so great, his pain so deep, he could not bear to talk about her. Maybe both. She said, I am so afraid, and I said, why? And she said, because I am so profoundly happy, Dr. Rasool. Happiness like this is a frightening. I asked her why, and she said they only let you be this happy if they are preparing to take something from you. And I said, hush up now, enough of this silliness. Farid took my arm. We should go, Amir Agha, he said softly. I snatched my arm away. What else did she say? The old man's features softened. I wish I remember for you, but I don't. Your mother passed away a long time ago, and my memory is as shattered as these buildings. I am sorry, but even a small thing, anything at all. The old man smiled. I will try to remember, and that's a promise. Come back and find me. Thank you. I said, thank you so much. I meant it. Now I knew my mother had liked almond cake with honey and hot tea, that she could once use the word profoundly, that she had fretted about her happiness. I had just learned more about my mother from this old man on the street than I ever did from Baba. Walking back to the truck, neither one of us commented about what most non-Afghans would have seen as an improbable coincidence, that a beggar on the street would happen to know my mother, because we both knew that in Afghanistan, and particularly in Kabul, such absurdity was commonplace. Baba used to say, take two Afghans who have never met, put them in a room for 10 minutes, and they will figure out how they are related. We left the old man on the steps of that building. I meant to take him up on his offer, come back and see if he had unearthed any more stories about my mother, but I never saw him again. We found the new orphanage in the northern part of Kartisay along the banks of the dried up Kabul River. It was a flat barracks style building with splintered walls and windows bordered with planks of wood. Farid had told me on the way there that Kartisay had been one of the most war-ravaged neighborhoods in Kabul. As we stepped out of the truck, the evidence was overwhelming. The Cattered streets were flanked by little more than ruins of shelled buildings and abandoned homes. We passed the rusted skeleton of an overturned car, a TV set with no screen half buried in a rubble, a wall with the word Zindabad Taliban, Long Live Taliban spread in black. A short, thin, balding man with a shaggy grey beard opened the door. He wore a ragged tweed jacket, a skull cap, and a pair of eyeglasses with one chipped lens resting on the tip of his nose. Behind the glasses, tiny eyes like black peas flitted from me to Farid. "Salaam alaikum," he said. "Salaam alaikum," I said. Showed him the Polaroid. "We are searching for this boy." He gave the photo a cursory glance. "I am sorry, I have never seen him." "You barely looked at the picture, my friend," Farid said. "Why not take a closer look?" "Lot fan," I added. "Please." The man behind the door took the picture, studied it, handed it back to me. "Nah, sorry, I know just about every single child in this institution and that one doesn't look familiar. Now, if you will permit me, I have work to do." He closed the door, locked the bolt. I rapped on the door with my knuckles. Aga, please open the door. We don't mean him any harm. I told you he's not here." His voice came from the other side. "Now, please go away." Farid stepped up to the door, rested his forehead on it. "Friend, we are not with the Taliban," he said in a low, cautious voice. "The man who is with me wants to take this boy to the safe place." "I come from Peshawar," I said. "A good friend of mine knows an American couple there who run a charity home for children." I felt the man's presence on the other side of the door, sensed him standing there listening, hesitating, caught between suspicion and hope. "Look, I knew Sarab's father," I said. "His name was Hassan, his mother name was Fazana. He called his grandmother Sasa. He knows how to read and write, and he's good with the slingshot. There's hope for this boy. Aga, a way out. Please open the door." From the other side, only silence. "I am his half uncle," I said. A moment passed, then a key rattled in the lock. The man's narrow face reappeared in the crack. He looked from me to Farid and back. "You were wrong about one thing." "What?" "He is great with a slingshot." I smiled. "He is inseparable from that thing. He tucks it in the waist of his pants everywhere he goes." The man who let us in introduced him as Zaman, the director of the orphanage. "I will take you to my office," he said. We followed him through dim, grimy hallways where barefoot children dressed in frayed sweaters ambled around. We walked past rooms with no floor covering but matted carpets and windows shuttered with sheets of plastic. Skeleton frames of steel beds, most with no mattress, filled the rooms. "How many orphans live here?" Farid asked. "More than we have room for, about 250, Zaman said over his shoulder. "But they are not all yatim. Many of them have lost their fathers in the war and their mothers can't feed them because the Taliban don't allow them to work, so they bring their children here." He made a sweeping gesture with his hand and added ruefully, "This place is better than the street, but not that much. This building was never meant to be lived in. It used to be a storage warehouse for a carpet manufacturer, so there's no water heater and they have let the well go dry." He dropped his voice. I have asked the Taliban for money to dig a new well more times than I remember, and they just twirled their rosaries and tell me there is no money." "No money," he snickered. He pointed to a row of beds along the wall. "We don't have enough beds and not enough mattresses for the beds we do have. Worse, we don't have enough blankets." He showed us a little guard skipping rope with 2 other kids. "You see that guard? This past winter the children had to share blankets. Her brother died of exposure." He walked on. "The last time I checked, we have less than a month's supply of rice left in the warehouse, and when that runs out, the children will have to eat bread and tea for the breakfast and dinner." I noticed the maid no mention of lunch. He stopped and turned to me. "There is very little shelter here, almost no food, no clothes, no clean water. What I have an ample supply here is children who have lost their childhood. But the tragedy is that these are the lucky ones. We are filled beyond capacity, and every day I turn away mothers who bring their children." He took a step toward me. You say there is hope for Sarab. I pray you don't lie, Agha, but you may well be too late. What do you mean? Zaman's eyes shifted. Follow me. What passed for the director's office was four bare cracked walls, a mat on the floor, a table, and two folding chairs. As Zaman and I sat down, I saw a grey rat poke its head from a burrow in the wall and flit across the room. I cringed when it sniffed at my shoes, then Zaman's, and scurried through the open door. What did you mean it may be too late? I said. Would you like some chai? I could make some. Nah, thank you. I would rather we talk. Zaman tilted back in his chair and crossed his arm on his chest. What I have to tell you is not a pleasant, not to mention that it may be very dangerous. From whom? You, me, and of course for Saurabh, if it's not too late already. I need to know, I said. He nodded. So you say, but first I want to ask you a question. How badly do you want to find your nephew? I thought of the street fights we could get into when we were kids all the time. Hassan used to take them on for me, 2 against 1, sometimes 3 against 1. I had twins and was tempted to step in, but always stopping short, always held back by something. I looked at the hallway, saw a group of kids dancing in a circle. A little girl, her left leg amputated below the knee, sat on a ratty mattress and was smiling and clapping along with the other children. I saw Farid watching the children too, his own mangled hand hanging at his side. I remembered Wahid's boys and I realized something. I would not leave Afghanistan without finding Saurabh. Tell me where he is, I said. Zaman's gaze lingered on me, then he nodded, picked up a pencil and twirled it between his fingers. Keep my name out of it, I promise. He tapped the table with the pencil. Despite your promise, I think I will live to regret this, but perhaps it's just as well. I am damned anyway, but if something can be done for Saurabh, I will tell you, because I believe you have the look of desperate man. He was quiet for a long time. There is a Talib official, he muttered. He visits once every month or two. He brings cash with him, not a lot, but better than nothing at all. His shifty eyes fell on me, rolled away. Usually he will take a guard, but not always. And you allow this? Farid sat behind me. He was going around the table, closing it on Zaman. What choice do I have? Zaman shot back. He pushed himself away from the decks. You are the director here, Farid said. Your job is watch over these children. There's nothing I can do to stop it. You are selling children, Farid barked. Farid, sit down, let it go, I said, but I was too late, because suddenly Farid was leaping over the table. Zaman's chairs went flying as Farid fell on him and pinned him to the floor. The director thrashed beneath Farid and made muffled screaming sounds. His legs kicked, a desk drawer free, and sheets of paper spilled to the floor. I ran around the desk and saw why Zaman's screaming was muffled. Farid was strangling him. I grasped Farid's shoulder with both hands and pulled hard. He snatched away from me. That's enough, I barked, but Farid's face had flushed red. His lips pulled back in a snarl. I am killing him. You can't stop me. I am killing him, he sneered. Get off him. I am killing him. Something in his voice told me that if I didn't do something quickly, I would witness my first murder. The children are watching, Farid. They are watching, I said. His shoulder muscle tightened under my grip, and for a moment I thought he would keep squeezing Zaman's neck anyway. Then he turned around, saw the children. They were standing silently by the door, holding hands, some of them crying. I felt Farid's muscles slacken. He dropped his hand, rose to his feet. He looked down on Zaman and dropped a mouthful of spit on his face. Then he walked to the door and closed it. Zaman struggled to his feet, blotted his bloody lips with his sleeve, wiped the spit off his cheek, coughing and wheezing. He put on his skull cap. His glasses, saw both lenses had cracked, and took them off. He buried his face in his hands. None of us said anything for a long time. He took Saurabh a month ago. Zaman finally croaked, hands still shielding his face. You call yourself a director? Farid said. Zaman dropped his hands. I haven't been paid in over 6 months. I am broken because I have spent my life saving on this orphanage. Everything I ever owned or inherited, I sold to run this gold forsaken place. You think I don't have family in Pakistan and Iran? I could have run like everyone else, but I didn't. I stayed because of them. He pointed to the door. If I deny him one child, he takes 10. So I let him take one and leave the judging to Allah. I swallow my pride and take his goddamn filthy dirty money. Then I go to the bazaar and buy food for the children. Farid dropped his eyes. What happens to the children he takes? I asked. Zaman rubbed his eyes with his forefinger and thumb. Sometimes they come back. Who is he? How do we find him? I said. Go to the Ghazi Stadium tomorrow. You will see him at halftime. He will be the one wearing black sunglasses. He picked up his broken glasses and turned them in his hand. I want you to go now. The children are frightened. He escorted us out. As the truck pulled away, I saw Zaman in the side view mirror standing in the doorway. A group of children surrounded him, clutching the hem of his loose shirt. I saw he had put on his broken glasses. Chapter number 21. We crossed the river and drove north through the crowded Pashtunistan square. Baba used to take me to Khyber restaurant there for kebab. The building was still standing, but its doors were padlocked, the windows shattered, and the letters K and R missing from its name. I saw a dead body near the restaurant. There had been a hanging. A young man dangled from the end of a rope tied to a beam, his face puffy and blue. The clothes he had worn on the last day of his life, shredded, bloody. Hardly anyone seemed to notice him. We rode silently through the square and headed towards the Wazir Akbar Khan district. Everywhere I looked, a haze of dust covered the city and its sun-dried brick building. A few blocks north of Pashtunistan Square, Farid pointed to two men talking animatedly at a busy street corner. One of them was hobbling on one leg, his other leg amputated below the knee. He cradled an artificial leg in his arm. You know what they are doing? Haggling over the leg. He is selling his leg. Farid nodded. You can get good money for it on the black market. Feed your kids for a couple of weeks. To my surprise, most of the houses in the Wazir Akbar Khan district still had roofs and standing walls. In fact, they were in pretty good shape. Trees still peeked over the walls, and the streets were not nearly as rubble-strewn as the ones in Karti's faded street sign. Some twisted and bullet-pocketed still pointed the way. This is not bad, I remarked. No surprise, most of the important people live here now. Taliban, them too, Farid said. Who else? He drove us into a wide street with a fairly clean sidewalks and walled homes on either side. The people behind the Taliban, the real brains of this government, if you can call it that. Arabs, Chechens, Pakistanis, Farid said. He pointed northwest, street 15. That way is called a Sarke Mehmana, street of the guests. That's what they call them here, guests. I think someday these guests are going to pee all over the carpet. I think that's it, I said. Over there, I pointed to the landmark Dad used to serve as a guide for me when I was a kid. If you ever get lost, Baba used to say, remember that our street is the one with the pink house at the end of it. The pink house with the steeply pitched roof had been the neighborhood's only house of that color in the old days. It still was. Farid turned onto the street. I saw Baba's house right away. We find the little turtle behind tangles of sweet briar in the yard. We don't know how it got there, and we are too excited to care. We paint its shell a bright red. Hassan's idea and a good one. This way we will never lose it in the bushes. We pretended we are a pair of daredevil explorers. We have discovered a giant prehistoric monster in some distant jungle, and we have brought it back for the world to see. We set it down in the wooden wagon Ali built Hassan last winter for his birthday, pretended its giant steel cage. Behold the fire-breathing monstrosity We march on the grass and pull the wagon behind us around apple and cherry trees, which become skyscrapers soaring into clouds, heads poking out of thousands of windows to watch the spectacle passing below. We walk over the little semi-lunar bridge. Baba was built near a cluster of fig trees. It becomes a great suspension bridge joining cities and the little pond below. A foamy sea. Fireworks explode above the bridge. Massive pylons and armed soldiers salute us on both sides as gigantic steel cables shoot to the sky, the little turtle bouncing around the cab. We drag the wagon around the circular red brick driveway outside the wrought iron gates and return the salutes of the world's leaders as they stand and applaud. We are Hassan and Amir, famed adventurers and the world's greatest explorers, about to receive a medal of honor for our courageous feat. Gingerly, I walked up the driveway where tufts of weed now grew between the sun-faded bricks. I stood outside the gates of my father's house. Feeling like a stranger, I set my hands on the rusty bars, remembering how I would run through these same gates thousands of times as a child, for things that mattered not at all now, and yet had seemed so important. Then I peered in the driveway extension that led from the gates to the yard where Hassan and I took turns following. The summer we learned to ride a bike didn't look as wide or as long as I remembered it. The asphalt had split in a lightning streak pattern and more tangles of weed sprouted through the fissures. Most of the poplar trees had been chopped down. The tree Hassan and I used to climb to shine our mirrors into the neighbor's home, the ones still standing, were nearly leafless. The wall of ailing corn was still there, though I saw no corn ailing or otherwise along that wall now. The paint had begun to peel and sections of it had sloughed off altogether. The lawn had turned the same brown as the haze of the dust hovering over the city, dotted by the bald patches of dirt where nothing grew at all. A jeep was parked in the driveway and Dad looked all wrong. Baba's black Mustang belongs there. For years the Mustang's 8 cylinders roared to life every morning, rousing me from sleep. I saw that oil had spilled under the jeep and stained the driveway like a big Rorschach means ink blot. Beyond the jeep, an empty wheelbarrow lay on its side. I saw no sign of the rose bushes that Baba and Ali had planted on the left side of the driveway. Only dirt had spilled onto the asphalt and weeds. Farid honked twist behind me. "We should go, Agha. We will draw attention," he called. "Just give me one more minute," I said. The house itself was far from the sprawling white mansion I remember from my childhood. It looked smaller, the roof sagged, and the plaster was cracked. The windows to the living room, the foyer, and the upstairs guest bathroom were broken, patched haphazardly with sheets of clear plastic or wooden boards nailed across the frames. The paint, once sparkling white, had faded the ghostly grey and eroded in parts, revealing the layered bricks beneath. The front step had crumbled like so much else in Kabul. My father's house was the picture of fallen splendor. I found the window to my old bedroom, second floor, third window south of the main step to the house. I stood on tiptoes, saw nothing behind the window but shadows. 25 years earlier, I had stood behind the same window, thick rain dripping down the panes and my breath fogging up the glass. I had watched Hassan and Ali load their belongings into the trunk of my father's car. "Amir Agha," Farid called again. "I am coming," I shouted back. Insanely, I wanted to go in, wanted to walk up the front step where Ali used to make Hassan and me take off our snow boots. I wanted to step into the foyer, smell the orange peel Ali always tossed into the stove to burn with sawdust, sit at the kitchen table, have tea with a slice of naan, listen to Hassan sing old Hazara song. Another honk, I walked back to the Land Cruiser parked along the sidewalk. Farid that smoking behind the wheel. "I have to look at one more thing," I told him. "Can you hurry?" "Give me 10 minutes. Go then." Then just as I was turning to go, I just forgot it all. Makes it easier. "To what?" "To go on," Farid said. He flicked his cigarette out of the window. "How much more do you need to see? Let me save you the trouble. Nothing that you remember has survived. Best to forget." "I don't want to forget anymore," I said. "Give me 10 minutes. We hardly broke a sweat, Hassan and I, when we hiked up the hill just north of Baba's house. We We scampered about the hilltop, chasing each other, or sat on a sloped ridge where there was a good view of the airport in the distance. We could watch airplanes take off and land, go running against. Now, by the time I reached the top of the craggy hill, each ragged breath felt like inhaling fire. Sweat trickled round my face. I stood wheezing for a while, a stitch in my side. Then I went looking for the abandoned cemetery. It didn't take me long to find it. It was still there, and so was the old pomegranate tree. I leaned against the grey stone gateway to the cemetery where Hassan had buried his mother. The old metal gates hanging off the hinges were gone, and the headstones were barely visible through the thick tangles of weed that had claimed the plot. A pair of crows sat on the low wall that enclosed the cemetery. Hassan had said in his letter that the pomegranate tree hadn't borne fruit in years. Looking at the wilted leafless tree, I doubted it ever would again. I stood under it, remembered all the times we had climbed it, straddled its branches, our legs swinging, dappled sunlight flickering through the leaves and casting on our faces a mosaic of light and shadow. The tangy taste of pomegranate crept into my mouth. I hunkered down on my knee and brushed my hand against the trunk. I found what I was looking for. The carving had dulled, almost faded altogether, but it was still there. Amir and Hassan, the sultans of Kabul. I traced the curve of each letter with my fingers, picked small bits of bark from the tiny crevices. I sat cross-legged at the foot of the tree and looked south on the city of my childhood. In those days, tree tops poked behind the walls of every house. The sky stretched white and blue, and laundry drying on clotheslines glimmered in the sun. If you listened hard, you might even have heard the call of the fruit seller passing through. Wazir Akbar Khan with his donkey. Cherries, apricot, grapes. In the early evening, you would have heard azan, the muezzin's call to the prayer from the mosque in Sharainu. I heard a honk and saw Farid waving at me. It was time to go. We drove south again, back toward Pashtunistan Square. We passed several more red pickup trucks with armed, bearded young men crammed into the cabs. Farid cursed under his breath every time we passed one. I paid for a room at a small hotel near Pashtunistan Square. Three little girls dressed in identical black dresses and white scarves clung to the slide. Spectated man behind the counter. He charged me $75, an unthinkable price given the run-down appearance of the place, but I didn't mind. Exploitation to finance a beach house in Hawaii was one thing, doing it to feed your kids was another. There was no hot running water, and the cracked toilet didn't flush. Just a single steel frame bed with a worn mattress, a rag blanket, and a wooden chair in the corner. The window overlooking the square had broken, had not been replaced. As I lowered my suitcase, I noticed a dried blood stain on the wall behind the bed. I gave Freeze some money and he went out to get food. He returned with 4 sizzling skewers of kebab, fresh naan, and a bowl of white rice. We sat on the bed and all but devoured the food. There was one thing that hadn't changed in Kabul after all. The kebab was as succulent and delicious as I remembered. That night I took the bed and Farid lay on the floor, wrapped himself with an extra blanket for which the hotel owner charged me an additional fee. No light came into the room except for the moonbeam streaming through the broken window. Farid said the owner had told him that Kabul had been without electricity for 2 days now and his generators needed fixing. We talked for a while. He told me about growing up in Mazar-e-Sharif in Jalalabad. He told me about a time shortly after he and his father joined the jihad and fought Ravi in the Panjshir Valley. They were stranded without food and ate locusts to survive. He told me of the day helicopter gunfire killed his father, of the day the land mine took his 2 daughters. He asked me about America. I told him that in America you could step into a grocery store and buy any of 15 or 20 different types of cereal. The lamb was always fresh and the milk cold, the fruit plentiful and the water clear. Every home had a TV and every TV a remote, and you could get a satellite dish if you wanted. Receive our 500 channels. 500, Farid exclaimed. 500. We fell silent for a while. Just when I thought he had fallen asleep, Farid chuckled. Agha, did you hear what Mullah Nasruddin did when his daughter came home and complained that her husband had beaten her? I could feel him smiling in the dark, and a smile of my own formed on my face. There was not an Afghan in the world who didn't know at least a few jokes about the bumbling Mullah. What? He beat her too, then sent her back to tell the husband that Mullah was on fool. If the bastard was going to beat his daughter, then Mullah would beat his wife in return. I laughed, partly at the joke, partly at how Afghan humor never changed. Wars were waged, the internet was invented, and a robot had rolled on the surface of Mars. And in Afghanistan, we were still telling Mullah Nasruddin jokes. Did you hear about the time Mullah had placed a heavy bag on his shoulders and was riding his donkey? I said no. Someone on the street said, why don't you put the bag on the donkey? And he said, that would be cruel. I am heavy enough already for the poor thing. He exchanged Mullah Nasruddin jokes until we ran out of them and we fell silent again. Amir Agha, Farid said, startling me from a near sleep. Yes. Why are you here? I mean, why are you really here? I told you, for the boy. Farid shifted on the ground. It's hard to believe. Sometimes I myself can't hardly believe I am here. No, what I mean to ask is, why, Dad, boy? You come all the way from the America for a Shia? That killed all the laughter in me and the sleep. I am tired, I said. Let's just get some sleep. Farid's snoring soon echoed through the empty room. I stayed awake, hands crossed on my chest, starting into the starlit night through the broken window and thinking that maybe what people said about Afghanistan was true. Maybe it was a hopeless place. A bustling crowd was filling Ghazi Stadium when we walked through the entrance tunnels. Thousands of people milled about the tightly packed concrete terraces. Children played in the aisles and chased each other up and down the steps. The scent of garbanzo beans in spicy sauce hung in the air, mixed with the smell of dung and sweet. Farid and I walked past street peddlers selling cigarettes, pine nuts, and biscuits. A scrawny boy in tweed jacket grabbed my elbow and spoke into my ear, asked me if I wanted to buy some sexy pictures. Very sexy, Agha, he said, his alert eyes darting side to side, reminding me of a girl who a few years earlier had tried to sell me crack in the Tenderloin district in San Francisco. The kid peeled one side of his jacket open and gave me a fleeting glance of his sexy pictures, postcards of Hindi movies showing doe-eyed, sultry actresses fully dressed in the arms of their leading men. So sexy, he repeated. Nah, thanks, I said, pushing past him. He gets caught, they will give him a flogging that will waken his father in the grave, Farid muttered. There was no assigned seating, of course. No one to show us politely to our section, aisle, row, and seat. There never had been, even in the old days of the monarchy. We found a decent spot to sit just left of midfield, though it took some shoving and elbowing on Farid's part. I remembered how green the playing field grass had been in 70s when Baba used to bring me to soccer games here. Now the pitch was a mess. There were holes and craters everywhere, most notably a pair of deep holes in the ground behind the south end goal posts. And there was no grass at all, just dirt. When the two teams finally took the field, all wearing long pants despite the heat, and play began, it became difficult to follow the ball in the clouds of dust kicked up by the players. Young toting talibs roamed the aisles, striking anyone who cheered too loudly. They brought them out shortly after the half-time whistle blew. A pair of dusty red pickup trucks like the ones I had seen around town since I had arrived rode into the stadium through the gates. The crowd rose to its feet. A woman dressed in a green burqa sat in the cab of one truck, a blindfolded man in the other. The trucks drove around the track slowly as if to let the crowd get long look. It had the desired effect. People craned their necks, pointed, stood on tiptoes. Next to me, Farid's Adam apple bobbed up and down as he mumbled a prayer under his breath. The red trucks entered the playing field, roared towards one, and in twin clouds of dust, sunlight reflecting off their hubcaps. A third truck met them at the end of the field. This one's cab was filled with something, and I suddenly understood the purpose of those two holes behind the goalpost. They unloaded the third truck. The crowd murmured in anticipation. "Do you want to stay?" Free said gravely. "No," I said. I had never in my life wanted to be away from a place as badly as I did now, but we have to stay. Two talibs with Kalashnikovs slung across their shoulders helped the blindfolded man from the first truck, and two others helped the burqa-clad woman. The woman's knees buckled under her and she slumped to the ground. The soldiers pulled her up and she slumped again. When they tried to lift her again, she screamed and kicked. I will never, as long as I draw breath, forget the sound of that scream. It was the cry of a wild animal trying to pry its mangled leg free from the bear trap. Two more talib joined in and helped force her into one of the chest-deep holes. The blindfolded man, on the other hand, quietly allowed them to lower him into the hole dug for him. Now only the accused pair's torsos protruded from the ground. A chubby, white-bearded cleric dressed in a grey garment stood near the goalpost and cleared his throat into the hand-held microphone. Behind him, the woman in the hole was still screaming. He recited a lengthy prayer from the Quran, his nasal voice undulating through the sudden bush of the stadium's crowd. I remember something Baba had said to me a long time ago. Piss on the beards of all those self-righteous monkeys. They do nothing but thumb their rosaries and recite a book written in a tongue they don't even understand. God help us all if Afghanistan ever falls in their hands. When the prayer was done, the cleric cleared his throat. "Brothers and sisters," he called, speaking in Farsi, his voice booming through the stadium, "we are here today to carry out Sharia. We are here to carry out justice. We are here today because the will of Allah and the word of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, are alive and well here in Afghanistan, our beloved homeland. We listen to what God says and we obey because we are nothing but humble, powerless creatures before God's greatness." And what does God say? I ask you, what does God say? God says that every sinner must be punished in a manner befitting his sin. Those are not my words, nor the words of my brothers. Those are the words of God. He pointed with his free hand to the sky. My head was pounding and the sun felt much too hot. Every sinner must be punished in a manner befitting his sin. The cleric repeated into the mic, lowering his voice, enunciating each word slowly, dramatically. "And what manner of punishment, brothers and sisters, befits the adulterer? How shall we punish those who dishonor the sanctity of marriage? How shall we deal with those who spit in the face of God? How shall we answer those who throw stones at the windows of God's house? We shall throw the stones back." He shut off the microphone. A low-pitched murmur spread through the crowd. Next to me, Farid was shaking his head. "And they call themselves Muslim," he whispered. Then a tall, broad-shouldered man stepped out of the pickup truck. The sight of him drew cheers from a few spectators. This time no one was struck with a whip for cheering too loudly. The tall man's sparkling white garment glimmered in the afternoon sun. The hem of his loose shirt fluttered in the breeze. His arms spread like those of Jesus on the cross. He greeted the crowd by turning slowly in a full circle. When he faced our section, I saw he was wearing dark round sunglasses like the ones John Lennon wore. "That must be our man," Farid said. The tall talib with the black sunglasses walked into the pile of stones they had unloaded from the third truck. He picked up a rock and shot it to the crowd. The noise fell, replaced by a buzzing sound that ripped through the stadium. I looked around me and saw that everyone was tasking the talib, looking absurdly like a baseball pitcher on the mound, hurled the stone at the blindfolded man in the hole. It struck the side of his head. The woman screamed again. The crowd made a startled "oh" sound. I closed my eyes and covered my face with my hands. The spectators' "oh" rhymed with each flinging of the stone, and that went on for a while. When they stopped, I asked Farid if it was over. He said no. I guess the people's throat had tired. I don't know how much longer I sat with my face in my hand. I know that I reopened my eyes when I heard people around me asking, Maud, is he dead?" The man in the hole was now a mingled mess of blood and shredded rags. His head slumped forward, chin on chest. The Talib in the John Lennon sunglasses was looking down at another man squatting next to the hole, tossing a rock up and down in his hand. The squatting man had one end of a stethoscope. The stethoscope from his ears and shook his head no at the Talib in the sunglasses. The crowd mourned. John Lennon walked back to the mount. When it was all over, when the bloodied corpses had been unceremoniously tossed into the backs of red pickup trucks, separate ones, a few men with shovels hurriedly filled the holes. One of them made a passing attempt of covering up the large blood stains by the kicking dirt over them. A few minutes later, the team took the field. Second half was underway. Our meeting was arranged for 3 o'clock that afternoon. The swiftness with which the appointment was set surprised me. I had expected delays, a round of questioning at least, perhaps a check of our paper, but I was reminded of how unofficial, even official matters still were in Afghanistan. All Farid had to do was tell one the whip-carrying Talibs that we had personal business to discuss with the man in white. Farid and he exchanged words. The guy with the whip then nodded and shouted something in Pashto to a young man on the field, who ran to the south end goal post where the Talib in the sunglasses was chatting with the plum cleric who had given the sermon. The three spoke. I saw the guy in the sunglasses look up. He nodded, said something in the messenger's ear. The young man relayed the message back to us. It was set then 3 o'clock.